I'm here today with Tambry Harris. Tambry is a leadership and life coach, survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and founder of Going Forward, Survivors to Thrivers, an organization that provides individual guidance, retreats, and speaking engagements to bring awareness and light into the shame, silence, and darkness that surrounds sexual abuse. Tambry has a master's degree in applied psychology and certifications in leadership coaching, spiritual direction, diversity, and change management. After spending 16 years in corporate America, Tambry created her own coaching practice to help individuals enhance their effectiveness and claim lives of significance. She found her voice, named her truth, and created a vision around how she could help others who have experienced the pain and shame of sexual abuse to find healing, strength, and freedom. Through her book, Awakening the Light, she shares her inspiring journey of moving from survivor to thriver and creating the Going Forward movement. Her dream is that survivors of sexual abuse will no longer be trapped by fear and limitations from their old stories and can claim wholehearted, life-giving, going forward stories. So Tambry, thank you so much for joining us, and many congratulations for all the accomplishments that you had.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian.
So before we get into the book, please tell us a little bit more about, your background and going forward and how that all started.
Okay, absolutely. So I've always had a heart to help people. I think about, it even goes back to being a candy striper in a hospital. And I don't know if we still have those or not, but that's how far back this kind of heart for others goes. And I ended up getting my master's in psychology, and I really wanted to work in corporate spaces. And so the master's is actually industrial organizational psychology. And so what that does is it applies psychological principles to the interactions and inner workings of different organizations. And so that, like you said, that's where I spent my first years. And it was really a lot about helping organizations identify and create the culture that they wanted, helping teams with interpersonal dynamics, and then also helping coach leaders in those spaces. And I learned a great deal. I had, worked with wonderful organizations, but I finally got to the place where I was ready to do it on my own. So I branched out and started my own company, basically doing all three things, but increasingly I was drawn more toward the leadership and life coaching. And so I continued to do that work, all the while having this stream of spiritual formation within myself. And so as I kept growing deeper in my faith, I thought I would love to be able to somehow complement my growth with my the coaching and team development that I do. And so as I did some research, that's where spiritual direction kind of surfaced for me. And I'd never heard of it before, although it's been around for like eons. But anyway, so I ended up becoming a certified diversity, I was that too, but spiritual director about 8 years ago. And that I really seek to support the mind, body, spirit health of individuals and helping them try and claim that full life. And so those were two streams of my background. And then the other stream that's important, and you alluded to it in the introduction, is that I was about 35 and I was in a corporate work setting at a workshop. And the workshop was on energy and the impact that negative energy can have on our performance. And so I'm sitting there listening to this, and through the demonstration, I ended up basically being triggered and having a panic attack. And I had never had a panic attack before. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm in corporate America, so I'm like trying to keep it all together, right? So sure. I kind of maintain myself, but as soon as a break came, I kind of scanned to figure out who the safest person was. And I grabbed her, took her to the side and said, oh my goodness, this just happened to me. And the beautiful thing is that, first of all, she was just present for me, and she encouraged me. She said, I've had something like that too. And I encourage you to kind of do some counseling, go to therapy, and figure out what's underneath this. And the what's underneath this is what I had repressed for 30 years, which was that I was a childhood sexual abuse victim.
Wow.
So, there were years of, and it's one of those things that so many of us, and this is part of, again, the how you can use your story to help others. There's so many of us that have these pieces that just don't make sense. And you start peeling back the layers. And this was, it took me a while to get to this because there were all other sorts of things I had to work through before I got to this deeply hidden part of me. But then I began to understand limiting beliefs that I held within myself. And that then helped make some patterns that I had fallen into make sense. So for example, I had this sense that I was not worthy. Sadly, a lot of us do for whatever reason. And so my sense of not being worthy led me to, well, I've got to get, I was actually a doctoral program at one point. I've got to get my doctorate. I've got to get this certification. I've got to achieve this level of accommodations and, and accolades in corporate America. And so this striving, ever striving and perfectionistic piece all went back to that little girl who didn't feel worthy.
Wow.
And part of it was no one came to her aid. And I believe, when we're little, we have that sense that it's all about us. And so if it's all about us and nobody's seeing me, nobody's intervening, then it must be about me as to why. So, I just think it's so important and that's again part of my heart and I want to help is for people to know that there's so many of us that do have this kind of underlying piece. And we can talk about woundedness or brokenness, but there's this part of us. And the unfortunate thing for me was that it led me into unhealthy patterns. I mentioned the one about the perpetual striving, but another was that I didn't expect people in relationships to treat me well.
Wow.
So that leads you into, for me, it led me into unhealthy marriages, domestically violent.
Wow.
And so all of that, those three streams, right? My education and then my spiritual formation and then my personal, growth and development and processing and journeying around this all led me to the point that you mentioned where I founded the Going Forward Survivors organization because 4 years ago when all the hashtag #MeToo hands started going up,
right,
I was so mixed in my feelings. I was so proud of them. My heart hurt for them. And I wondered how many of them kind of raised their hand, but then the hand went down and they went back into the shame and silence that so many of us experience because of the culture that surrounds this topic. And so that's why I was like, I want people to know that, there are some of us that are out there wanting to bring encouragement and hope. And because of my background, I can bring modes of healing. And so that's really what kind of started me along the path that, like I said, 3 to 4 years ago.
Wow. So is that when you started Going Forward was like 3 or 4 years ago?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Wow. So then more recently than that, you've written the book that I mentioned. Let me get to the title again here. Awakening the Light.
Yes.
So can you talk about, how that came about? What motivated you to write that book?
Yes. It's interesting. I mentioned again that I've been a leadership coach and I lead retreats and things like that. Well, I had an author come to me and he had written a book and he wanted me to help him with talks and as well as workshops that were surrounded kind of based on his book. And so that's how we developed a relationship. And then over time, he wanted to write a second book and he wanted me to partner with him. And what I liked about that was we both were talking about our woundedness and how we grew and what we learned and our hopes for others. And I kind of like the male-female voice around the topic. So I wrote my part and ended up, getting pretty far along. And then he started getting caught up in other things and basically said, Tambry, I'm just not in a place where I'm ready to do this right now. So and at this point, I've almost got my part written. And I really believe that was God's way of getting me there. I never saw myself as an author. And so to have him kind of move me and get me there. And then when he moved away, I'm like, well, darn it, I've already done so much work.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
have such a heart for what my message. And what's beautiful is that now it can be much more focused for me. It can really be my pure message. And so the title, Awakening the Light, it has two different angles to it. One is I want to awaken the light in each and every survivor. And I'm talking survivors of sexual abuse, domestic violence. There's a variety of different kinds of abuse. And people who have read it have told me, Tambry, this applies to so many different areas. And so, trying to awaken that beautiful light that's within you that may have gotten covered over because of some of your experiences. But I also want to awaken the light on this topic because, again, culturally, I had a cousin of mine who's much younger than me, who's also a sexual abuse survivor, said, Tambry, this is the topic that no one will talk to me about. They talk to me about everything. This is the one. He said, it's like, and I love this, it's like Lord Voldemort with Harry Potter.
Okay.
He said, you can't speak the name. It has to be kept in the dark. And so that is my motivation, is to speak the name, make us more comfortable in having this conversation, because the longer we don't want to talk about it, the more people that are being hurt and the more people that are staying in their wounded space and not moving forward to become their full selves. And so, it's a going forward survivors to thrivers story. It's mine, but it's also the readers. And so that's kind of behind, the meaning behind the title.
So it's very clear who the target audience is then, for the book. That's a nice aspect of any book, right? Is that it's very clear who it's for.
What's been beautiful though is that, yes, I was very clear, and my publisher was like, okay, make sure you know your target audience, age range and all that kind of stuff. But what's been really beautiful is that who I call the supporters, which is everybody else, because if it didn't happen to you, it happened to one of your loved ones. And so what I've found is that supporters have been able to read the book and better understand what's going on, because I'm not graphic by any means, but I describe what's going on a lot internally with me, and so it kind of helps them understand how the mind, body, spirit is formed and harmed by abuse, and the journey to do the healing work. And so supporters can better understand their loved one by reading it. So it ended up, although I had my target audience, it ended up being a resource for both sides.
Well, I can imagine pastors too, and other people that are kind of in a caregiving role in various ways, would really benefit from that understanding as well.
I've actually been invited to speak at it's a day retreat being held by Stephen Ministers. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yes.
They're sponsoring it, and it's about healing trauma. And basically, one of my messages is, as you're sitting across as a Stephen Minister or as a pastor or as a therapist, when you're sitting across, that therapist obviously, but as a coach, the person you're sitting across, there's high percentage. I mean, there's 40% of women that have been sexually abused.
Wow.
And 1 in 4 women have been in domestically violent situations. And so there's a high chance that the person sitting across from you has experienced this. And so having increased level of sensitivity and understanding around one story, but there's different elements of my story that really do resonate with most. It increases the understanding and even compassion for the complexity of what's going on.
Sure. So I'm sure there are other books that have been written about this general area. How does yours differ?
I was not motivated to necessarily share my story. And it actually was something that I vetted with some people before like my mother. Like my daughter was 18 at the time.
Hmm.
And so, making sure they were comfortable before I put my story out, because, yeah, you're kind of shining a light on all those others around you, right? So my intention is to share my story, but for the purpose of you feeling a kindred spirit. So as I describe my story, I ask you questions all along the way.
Hmm.
And so I talk about the fact that why I believe no one came to my aid was because we were having someone die every year. And these are people in their 30s. Okay.
Hmm.
And so lots and lots of trauma, lots of reeling. And so you don't mourn, you don't deal, you just gird up and move on because the next one's right around the corner.
Wow.
And so a question I would ask in the book is, how did your family talk about trauma? Beginning to get you to reflect on just some of those dynamics that have formed who you are. And so the first half of the book is about me, but it's not about me. It's about inviting you into my story and helping you start figuring out yours. The second half of the book is about the reader claiming their going forward story. And so again, I kind of weave in all those things that are me, the leadership and life coach, the spiritual director. I'm asking you questions and helping you process, even the change management person that I do it from a personal change management, because as you know, it is really hard to go into the unknown. But at least we know what we're dealing with right here. To step into a new space could be scary. And so talking about the change management dynamics. And so I really try and help the reader feel my support throughout the book and ask questions to help you look at your underlying beliefs, look at some of those patterns, and then claim those things, and then get you, from a change management perspective, get you in a place of, as you move toward that change, how do you ground yourself in that future state so that you can continue to move toward thriving.
So I always find it fascinating to hear how people got their first book deal. So how did this happen for you? How did you get it published?
Yeah, it's interesting because it really is through the person I was working with. He already had established a relationship with the publisher.
Okay.
And so in some ways I had it easy in that it was, a lot. He had a lot of learnings from publishing his first book. And so I was kind of benefiting from those learnings and benefiting from some of the things that he had set into motion. Still all that to say, a lot of learnings on my part, but yeah, and I actually kind of went in the middle ground where it wasn't self-published, but it wasn't a big publisher, because I just really felt, this was something that I felt like God was calling me to do. And so I just, and what was really beautiful, to be able to fund it, I ended up doing a Kickstarter campaign. So people, to feel that sense of community to help make this book happen was really beautiful. And that's kind of my support community. Even when I, had my first book launch, that was my first community I came out to. And so there was there were so many benefits it ended up from. It wasn't easy to do the Kickstarter, but it ended up being a beautiful way to help this book come to be and to gain, support and community around it.
Interesting. So you and I met at Wild Goose Festival this year. And before we started our interview, we were talking about how wonderful an event that was. And Going Forward had a booth there. So can you talk just a little bit, from a business perspective, how did that work out for you?
It's, gosh, there's so many answers to that question. One of the things is that I was really surprised at how many different types of people came up. I had some fellow authors come up who wanted to learn more about the book themselves. I had other therapist type people coming up to understand. And that's been one of the beautiful things as I reached out to, you mentioned, that faith leaders could benefit from this book. I vetted it by a bunch of different therapists, and they see it as a resource because many times their person may have a hard time even beginning. They're not sure even where to begin. And so this kind of gives some probing questions. And So meeting other therapists and letting them know this book is a resource for them. Number of different pastors came up as well. So it was beautiful. One woman was the librarian at her church, and she's the one that gets all the books. And so I'm thinking, that's great. So anyway, so those kind of things were really, really wonderful. I would say it was really interesting. So many of the booths, people would be sitting back, and if someone came up, then you stand up and start talking to them. But my friend Nan was with me, and we were standing the whole time. And we tried to be so invitational because this is such, again, a shame-laden topic. So for people to even come up to our tent.
That's intimidating, yeah.
And so trying to be so inviting. And then once they come up, I share, a little bit of my story like I have with you, and then they inevitably end up sharing with me. And there's just this beautiful exchange and just seeing, and we had a raffle. We raffled off a basket with the book and the group growth guide. And the two different people, well, one of them, when she signed up on my list of contact list, I said, what do you want me to contact you for? Her answer was anything and everything. And so I just loved her openness to whatever, could come. And so the fact that she was one of the recipients of the raffle was really special. And then the other one, for the second day of the raffle, she received it and she said, she was like almost in tears and was just like, this is coming. It's such the right.
Wow.
So that all was beautiful. And then it gave me an opportunity to promote. I was actually speaking there as well. And so was able to say, hey, come see me at 2:00 on Sunday or whatever. Right. So that was lovely. And the people that were in the tent, just the level of engagement. And one gentleman came up to me later and just said, and this was such a blessing for me, was he said, he just felt spirit come over the tents, and that he knew people would stay as long as I was there because they just felt so connected. And so, wow. How can you put a price on that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
So there's so many different ways, like I said, to answer your question.
Sure.
All of that was gifts to me to be able to experience so many different types of people and ways we engaged.
Wow. Well, thank goodness that event was able to take place. As we were talking about, it's like, it was in September. So a lot of still concern about COVID, right? But they did a wonderful job of making sure that everyone that attended was vaccinated. The entire event was outdoors. So it felt pretty safe to me when I was there.
I agree. And you also had control over how close, if you went into more of a dense, you could wear masks. So yeah, they did a wonderful job of, feeling hospitable and being safe. I thought they did a great job with that.
So I know you just recently released this book and, but I have to ask the question, do you have any additional books that you're thinking about as a follow-up, or what else in terms of new things for going forward?
Yeah. So I had people increasingly talk about maybe doing it in a small group, having a small group go through this together. And one of the things, again, about our organization is trying to create a sense of community to help people feel support as they're going through this journey. And so the idea of coming together in a small, safe group, which we do for retreats, I look forward to getting back to having those, like maybe 5 or 6 kind of people. But so when I hear that, I love it. And the master psychology person and the spiritual director and the leadership life coach in me wants to make sure that it's a wonderful experience for them. And so that led me to create a group growth guide because I really wanted any facilitator, any group coming together could have a resource to let them know how to ground the group, how to have icebreakers to begin to get into this, and how to have conversations where you don't have to get into into the specifics, but you can, so that book actually came out in May. So
Okay.
yep. So I've released that. And then another one that's getting ready, I was asked to be part of a devotion collaboration on forgiveness. And so I have a devotion in this book, and I think it'll be coming out by the end of this year.
Oh, good. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So where can people go? What's the website address that, talks about you and your book and going forward?
Yeah. So it's Survivors to Thrivers. So it's plural, survivorstothrivers.com.
Okay.
And there we actually have blogs twice a month. And the intent behind that is the first of the month is to bring encouragement. And the one on the 15th is really to give exercises for people to do some of their healing work or to begin to explore. And so we provide that. We also have Instagram, which is Survivors to Thrivers as well, which is more of a weekly encouragement piece. But on the website, again, you can find out about the book. You can find out about, the individual guidance that we provide. And we also have a newsletter you can sign up for it's a quarterly, it's not real frequent, but a quarterly newsletter so you kind of know some of the happenings that are going on with us and offerings that we're providing.
Well, Tambry, congratulations again on, all this great work. And, thanks so much for taking some time to share it with us today.
Well, it's been a privilege. Thank you so much for having me, Brian.